My name is Clement Selman, and I serve as director of the National Institute for European Studies here at the Q School. As a school of global affairs, the Q School is interested in all matters that matter globally. The cause of Ukraine is a truly global cause. It is not a small regional conflict somewhere at the edges of the world. We are pleased to welcome Professor Rory Finnin back to campus as a man who deeply cares about Ukraine. Welcome back, Rory. Professor Finnin will be one of the keynote speakers and pillars of the major conference on Ukraine, Revolutions of Hope, that the National Institute is hosting this week, starting with the President's Forum tomorrow. I would like to take the opportunity to welcome Taras Shevchenko, Director of Ukrainian Catholic University. Since Rory Finnin is a very important person, he will be introduced by a very important person, named Professor Mary Gallagher, the very key dean of the Q School of Global Affairs. So this is the choreography of the 70 minutes event. I will briefly introduce Dean Gallagher, who will then introduce Professor Finnin, who will then deliver his lecture. After that, we have some time for questions. We will end at 1:40 the latest. Professor Mary Gallagher joined the Q School as its second dean in summer 2024. She has had some connection with our school since she served as an external reviewer of one of our units in the Lower Institute for Asian and Asian Studies. It is not too hard to conclude from this fact that Professor Gallagher is an expert on Asia, especially China. Professor Gallagher came to us from the University of Michigan, which we learned to love, as directed the International Institute that also had the Amy and Ellen Wilkenstein Chair in Democracy, Democratization, and Human Rights. Since Notre Dame is very careful in selecting its students, you will not be surprised that Mary Gallagher is an award-winning outstanding scholar who has published extensively in leading academic journals as well as in prominent media outlets such as the Washington Post and the New York Times. She's the author-editor of 5 books on contemporary China with Cambridge, Cornell, and Princeton. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brooklyn Teaching Consultant for the World Bank, the US government, and many other non-governmental and international organizations. Professor Gallagher earned a PhD in politics from Princeton University, her BA in government and East Asian Studies from Smith College. Her international experience includes teaching at the Foreign Affairs College in Beijing and visiting professorships in Shanghai. It mentions several universities, but I cannot pronounce them, such as We are grateful to the Mary Ventile Dean for being with us today. We very much appreciate her leadership and support as she steers the ship of the Q School in its next phase, and the ship of this event into its next phase in the introduction of our speaker. Please welcome dear Dean. Very nice. Very fun. I'm honored to introduce a distinguished friend of Notre Dame, Rory Finnin, professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge and founder of the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program. This is his second visit to campus. Last October, he received the Laura Shatton Prize in Contemporary European Studies for his book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity. And has received a total of 8 international awards already. And we're pleased to have him back this weekend and this week for our conference, Revolutions of Hope, that Professor Shevchenko just mentioned. Since launching the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program in 2008, Rory has curated and organized over 40 exhibits and cultural events, all of which have advanced public understanding of Ukraine's language, history, and society in the United Kingdom and beyond. He is the former head of the Department of Slavonic Studies and chair of the Cambridge Committee for Russian and Eastern European Studies. We don't begrudge the fact that he is a native of Cleveland. It's not good or the University of Michigan. And this current moment, that's what I'm talking about, which is football. Professor Finnin received his PhD in Slavic languages and comparative literature from Columbia University, and he holds certificates from the Harriman Institute and from the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. His research focuses on the interplay between culture and identity in Ukraine, with particular attention to Crimea and Crimean Tatar literature.
His broader interests include naturalism studies, solidarity studies, and cultural memory in the region of the Black Sea. We're pleased to welcome Professor Finnin as he presents his book, Freedom's Liberator, Taras Shevchenko and the Making of Modern Ukraine. Professor Finnin will introduce us to Shevchenko's poetry, which has inspired the pursuit of freedom and resistance to political oppression. One can read his work in the context of the long Ukrainian anti-colonial struggle, especially against Russian imperialism. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Finnin. Here's the mic.
Forgot about that. Mary, thank you, Clements. Thank you for this wonderful. I'm still thinking the mic is here. Thank you. Welcome to hospitality. It is wonderful to be back at Notre Dame. It is a really important time for us to be talking about Ukraine, about Ukrainian literature and culture. I want to, in particular, welcome all of our dear friends, colleagues, loved ones from Ukraine. We are really facing a pivotal moment in our history and in Ukraine's history. It is a fraught one, full of danger. So it's important that we have this opportunity here this week to talk more about Ukraine, to dive more deeply into its politics, its culture. Tomorrow we open the Revolution of Hope Conference at a time when I think the stakes of our knowledge about Ukraine are very high, when the implications of us not only learning about Ukraine, but learning from Ukraine have great implications for our own security. As you all know, Ukraine is the largest country by territory within the European continent. And as a state, it emerged over centuries from the peripheries of three different empires. Not one empire, not two, but three different empires. It is very diverse, highly dynamic, and as a cultural and historical object of knowledge, it is fascinating and endlessly complex. So today, I want to hack this complexity and explore with you Ukraine's source code, the poetry of Taras Shevchenko, born in 1814, and someone who died only days before the emancipations in the Russian Empire in 1861. Being that Shevchenko himself was a serf, as we'll discuss, that death and the timing of that death is really shameful. So I can only touch upon a few things, and I think our colleagues and loved ones from Ukraine will have a lot to say. So I'm really looking forward to a Q&A in which my Ukrainian colleagues can correct me, fill in certain blanks that an Irish kid from Cleveland is bound to be whooping. But what I've discovered over the course of my career is just how deeply the roots of modern Ukraine are forged and located in the rhythms and rhymes of Taras Shevchenko. And to do them any justice requires 40 weeks, not 40 minutes. And I'll stick to those 40 minutes. But even in 40 minutes, I hope to leave you today with a deeper understanding of Shevchenko's monumental achievement, without which I think modern political Ukraine would simply not be possible, because his art advances not a national genealogy, not some kind of national history. These are the kinds of things we normally expect from our national poets, after all. But his art advances something else. His art advances an ethos, an idea, an ethical disposition to others that forges bonds of attachment that are remarkably deep and broad. Now, all grassroots movements pursue freedom for their people. In this sense, Ukraine is not different. But Shevchenko, a former serf with a really intimate knowledge of oppression, and oppression that cut across ethnic and religious boundaries, he privileged universal democratic freedom himself. He did not constrain or restrict the project of freedom to Ukraine and Ukraine's borders alone. So this ethos, which I think is invested in almost every tenet of the concept of integral human development, is something that nothing less than change the map of Europe for generations. So what I'd like to do today is situate his work in both national contexts and international ones. And I'd like to talk to you today first about his capacity for forgiveness, this work of mercy in action, which ends up making Ukraine possible, Ukrainian civil society possible. Ukrainian civil society is the most dynamic and inventive in Europe and has been for a very long time. A lot of these films from Shevchenko's messages and his example. And then I'd like to focus on his solidarity with the subaltern, the solidarity with oppressed and marginalized peoples, not only in Ukraine, but all around the world, particularly in Central Asia. And this solidarity combats various hierarchies of empire and pursues in rather dogged fashion both universal charity and social justice. So to begin, what I'd like to do is widen the aperture for a moment and situate ourselves in what might be, for this conversation anyway, an unexpected place in time. I want to begin in June 2022 in Sochi, in today's Russian Federation on the coast of the Black Sea. So roughly 4 months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or at least the beginning of this horrific full-scale invasion, Putin, the chair of the African Union and president of Senegal, Macky Sall, in Sochi. And in press accounts of their visit, Putin was reported to have spoken with Sall repeatedly about, quote-unquote, fighting colonialism, by which he meant presumably Western colonialism. He certainly wasn't addressing Russian colonialism, which is highly extractive and exploitative right now in the African continent. And Putin also made a point of noting that Sochi had been a venue, a site for other conversations between African and Russian leaders over the years. Sochi just kept being repeated. Sochi, Sochi, Sochi. It was as if Putin was daring us to call out the hypocrisy, because Sochi was once Sacha, the capital of Circassia, a country that the Russian Empire wiped off the face of the earth over the course of 100 years. I think the so-called Russo-Circassian War. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The demographic, cultural, and political implications of this war were grave. The Tsars murdered and expelled billions of Circassian people, displaced them to other parts of the Black Sea region, particularly Ottoman Turkey. And again, this was a war waged by Russian forces for over 100 years. In other words, the Kremlin had ethnically cleansed and colonized the very place that Macky Sall, completely nowhere, was sitting and talking about colonialism. Russia's war against the Circassians was very well known and chronicled in detail in the United States in the 19th century. You can do an easy search on the New York Times just to see how frequently Circassian comes up. You can see how journalists discuss the tactics of the Russian military, their occasional defeats. And often these journalists made very unwise, hasty predictions of when the war would conclude. I want to quote from one of these articles. Russia is about to make a great effort to put an end at once and forever to the warfare in Circassia, which has now been raging without any appreciable result for 50 years and consumes annually a third of the imperial army. So this is 1857. The war would go on for another 7 years. You'll also see a note about the Circassian people themselves. The Circassians have received for a long while a great deal of sympathy at the hands of the civilized world. And then you'll see the conjunction but. And this, unfortunately, should sound strangely familiar today. I think, sadly, tragically, precious nonetheless remember this brutal century-long war, even though it claimed millions of lives. And the Kremlin banks on this ignorance. Russian and Russo-centric histories treat the war with a wave of the hand. Some argue that it never happened. Others argue that this act of conquest was really an annexation that was welcomed by the tribes, occasionally with bread and salt. You saw the true measure of their ignorance when the world gathered in Sochi in 2014 for the Winter Olympics. This photograph, for anybody who's been to Sochi, is absurd. It's a subtropical place on the Black Sea. No mountains appear like that near any water, of course. But for us, it didn't really matter. We barely batted an eyelid. The world forgot and let itself forget, except in Ukraine. And that has everything to do with Taras Shevchenko. Because anytime Ukrainians rise up in defense of freedom or the rule of law, anytime that they are combating against creeping authoritarianism and autocracy, they implicitly articulate, they speak forth in memory of this war of aggression waged by Russia against Circassia and the other peoples of the Caucasus. Not only that, they use words that are meant as inspiration and comfort for the very people who are fighting against Russian conquest. The words are, "Боритеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає." Fight on, you will prevail. God is helping you. So these are photographs I took in 2013-14 during the Revolution of Dignity, or the Maidan Revolution. Okay? On the surface of the text, this couplet comes from Taras Shevchenko's anti-colonial work of 1895, all of the Caucasus. It is addressed to the Circassian mountaineers who are defending themselves against Russian aggression, fighting back against Russian conquest. Let me read the lines. Slava Signore, Пригою Путин. Вам лісарі великі Богом не забути. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас сила і воля святая. This is a message, once again, meant for Muslim Circassian mountaineers, the Chechen, the Ingush, who are fighting against Russian aggression. But the magic of Shevchenko's poetry is how they resonate for Ukrainians as a message, of course, deeply, very clearly intended for them too, and never more than today. So this is an emblematic stroke, I would say, of a man who is the spark and flame of Ukrainian culture, whose image and appearance as a young man, as in this self-portrait of 1840, or as an older man, mustachioed with a stern gaze. These are images found all across Ukraine and around the world. You can see here in this image a monument to Shevchenko from the town of Borodyanka, which is northwest of the city of Kyiv. Borodyanka experienced horrific occupation in the first weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion. As you can see here, according to locals, the Russian troops made sure to shoot Shevchenko in the head. So you can see this bullet hole. And there's a very devastating and poignant story of a 9-year-old boy who couldn't speak of the horrors of occupation, but could speak his feelings of confusion and anger for this attack on Shevchenko's statue. He couldn't explain it. It is, of course, hard to understand. But Russian forces shot at this monument because they couldn't defeat Shevchenko's words. So, who was Shevchenko? My favorite characterization of the poet is by way of the Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov, who calls him the Dalai Lama of Ukraine, a man born smack dab in the middle of Ukraine in 1814. He deserves his own Hollywood blockbuster, and I've been calling for one for quite some time. A serf, quite literally the property of another human being, a serf who was born in central Ukraine and then became a painter who became a poet, and a poet who endured in pretty much exile to become the voice of a people, often begrudgingly so. And it's really difficult to overstate the significance of Shevchenko for Ukrainians across the country, across the centuries, and indeed across the globe. A few years ago, in 2018, I worked with colleagues at the London School of Economics about on a project really about political polarization in Ukraine. We used a lot of different kinds of surveys, focus groups, taking Ukrainians from different generations, different parts of the country, and consistently, Shevchenko was ranked the most beloved, most respected, and most revered figure, no matter if you were a Russian-speaking Ukrainian from Mariupol or Ukrainian-speaking person from Ivano-Frankivsk, whether you spoke Yiddish, Crimean Tatar, Shevchenko topped the list. So this admiration can actually be seen across time and space. One of the ways you can see it across time is by exploring the Ngram viewer. And if you're an undergraduate and not use the Ngram viewer, which effectively searches Google's digitized corpus, in the English language in particular, you can trace, for instance, certain terms and their usage and frequency over time. And you can see here the Shevchenko effect, as I would call it, in which the term Ukrainian is dynamically, precipitously higher after Shevchenko's work and career. But I want to focus on a few other images here. One from the region of Sumy in eastern Ukraine, very close to the border with Russia. And here you see an image of people gathering to celebrate the emergence of the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917, Ukrainska Narodna Respublika. If you look very closely in the center there, I've seen Shevchenko's portrait, which is right in the middle. And also, you'll see above the portrait a flag that reads Hai Живе Вільна Україна, let a free Ukraine live. You also see a flag that says Zemlya и Воля, land and freedom. And we're going to talk a bit about this concept of Volya in a moment. But it is a term that is often used across the Russian and Ukrainian languages, but has radically different meanings. Volya, in fact, is included in a dictionary of so-called untranslatable terms. It has a very long entry, in fact. But I think the term untranslatable doesn't quite fit Volya because, in fact, it's really too translatable. That is, it means a variety of different things. It can mean freedom in this conventional sense. It can mean will, and it can mean volition. In the Ukrainian case, these concepts are intertwined. So volya in the Ukrainian context is defiant freedom. It's the freedom that you have to exercise your will to claims against external forces that are always seeking to take it from you. So this is 1917 within the bounds of Ukraine in Sumy. Let's go 5,000 kilometers eastward around the same time to the city of Khabarovsk. And here you see, again, demonstration of Ukrainians also marking this emergence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was very progressive, center-left state securing territory against frequent Bolshevik invasions. I know this image is rather difficult to see, but you have to trust me that the portrait right in the center of the photograph is indeed of Taras Shevchenko. But even here, you can see Ukrainians taking to the streets to speak forth the idea of Ukrainian sovereignty, not only in mainland Ukraine, but also, in fact, in this very space. This space in the Russian Far East was called the Zelený Klin, or the Green Crescent. It was a space settled by many Ukrainians, sometimes forced there by the Tsar in the late 19th century. It was a very difficult place for Ukrainians to be Ukrainians because in 1863, the Ukrainian language was secretly forbidden. Publications were secretly forbidden and prohibited by Russian imperial censors. And then in 1876, the Tsar made it official with a kind of draconian 2.0 in which all Ukrainian language works were prohibited for publication. So in the Far East, it was difficult for Ukrainian migrants who were brought there to till the land. It was difficult for them to maintain their culture, their traditions, but they did. And they did so against great odds. And in 1917, amid the tumult and the chaos of the fall of the Russian Empire, these Ukrainians organized, a very familiar theme, and began to explore Ukrainian history. The organization of Ukrainians at grassroots level is constant. Maybe in the West, not often paid close enough attention to it. They organized at this time in the Far East in 1917. They even went so far as to organize what they called a secretariat of the Ukrainian Far East. They tried to mobilize an army. They appointed a premier. That premier had diplomatic relations with Chinese and Japanese diplomats. The idea was to create a Ukrainian polity on the shores of the Sea of Japan. And that may sound like the punchline to a Soviet-era joke, but it's not. And it's very, very important for us to embark on a closer study of projects like this, because it tells us a great deal about the vibrancy of the Ukrainian political and cultural project, one that we've been ignoring, I think, collectively for far too long. So, to what can we attribute this lasting resonance, this massive outside significance, this legacy of a man who was born a slave, but who never achieved political power, never owned an estate, never sat on a throne, never sat idly by while others were exploited? Above all, what secured his status were his poetic gifts with the Ukrainian language. We can't delve too deeply into it here, but take it from me that Shevchenko's corpus is lively, it's live, it's innovative, it sticks in your head. It is adventurous and artistically way ahead of its time. And I often tell students and Slavic study students actually that if you're looking to find a kind of Ukrainian Mickiewicz or Ukrainian Pushkin in Shevchenko, you will be craning your neck around every page, because he is not a conventional romantic. And if anything, he is very much a proto-modernist poet, well ahead of his time. He takes a lot of chances. He defies so many of our expectations. So I want to talk a little bit about his language and take this example from 1847, because I think it tells us absolutely everything. In 1847, Shevchenko had been arrested for his participation in a group called the Brotherhood of Saints Cyril and Methodius. He was the most rowdy of the members of this brotherhood. There were others who were more staid, academic, but Shevchenko was the one who could lift the room, inspire. When he was arrested, so many of his various poems were on his person. And the so-called third section, or the security services of the Russian Empire, discovered these various poems. You can see them in archives with these officers of the third section underscoring various terms that were radioactive, that called the Tsar, for instance, a serpent, neseti, aspide, lots of curse words and disparaging terms about the Tsar. So he's facing what he knows is a very long exile. And instead of indulging his fear, instead of inviting expressions of grief, what he does inside his prison cell is conjure for himself this wonderful idyll of a family retiring from a long day's work around a dinner table. Tablok vishnami polohate, Pushchina vishname chodot, pluhateri s pluhami idut, співають ідучі дівчата, а матері вечерять ждуть. Поклала мати коло хати маленький квіточок своїх. Сама заснула коло їх. Затикло все. Тільки дівчата та соловейко не затих. Notice how Shevchenko takes the rhyme that's normally at the end of a line and injects it everywhere. He embraces assonance, eternal rhyme. You have so many different sonic curly cues in this poem. It is a force of inspiration for himself as an individual, as a holistic person who's trying to hold it together in the face of Tsarist punishment. And indeed, that punishment comes. He's exiled for more than 10 years, and he's actually forbidden personally by the Tsar for writing, painting, drawing. But of course, he defies the order anyway. But it was a very draconian punishment. So, given this village scene, undergraduates might not think that this kind of verse actually gets included in the hip hop tune, but you'd be wrong, because it does. And here it is embedded in a song by the pop star Alina Pash, who uses it in a verse expressing pride in her country. And to turn Shevchenko's plowman that you just saw on the previous verse into figures who can presage a better future. So let's take a listen.
А бачити казала усе, коріння своє дороге. І мені ким брає взяти себе, і взяти свій край. Своя, своя гордість в мене є. А як же вишневий садок, круші там уже не готує. Та знає платарі з новими плугами йдуть. А як же вишневий садок, там уже не готує. Та знає платарі з новими плугами йдуть.
Some of the best performances and recitations of Shevchenko's poetry are coming from women, artists, musicians. We'll see one more example in a moment. So Shevchenko's cool factor is profound, but there's also something of a fear factor as well, especially when I speak to Ukrainian Americans who might have been forced to memorize Shevchenko's poetry in Saturday schools. I don't know if there's some here. Yeah, okay, so you remember, terrifying. I know this is the case often with some of my own students in Ukraine who were taught to learn this poet because he was the granite figure they often saw in city squares in various towns. But really what we need to do is understand how diverse and polyphonic his poetry is. Yeats once said that we make out of the quarrel with others rhetoric, and out of the quarrel with ourselves poetry. Shevchenko is constantly quarreling with himself. Faced with contradiction, he embraces it. Faced with opposition, he lets it linger. His lyrical persona is very hybrid, very multiple. It's opaque, hidden, sly. He's difficult to pin down. He can speak with the voice of the kobza player. Kobza being an instrument very much like the bandura, a national instrument of Ukraine, stringed instrument. He can employ the voice of a bombastic prophet. He can employ the voice of a downtrodden victim. He can even ventriloquize a chauvinist colonizer, which he does very satirically on many occasions. Ezra Pound once said that we should write poems like orchestral scores with many voices at once. So Shevchenko is very much this kind of poet, this kind of composer, which is why he reaches so many Ukrainians in so many different voices across the country. And here you can see the illustrator Alexander Frekov having some fun with this idea of the many different masks and personae that Shevchenko can adopt depending on his audience. But he embodies diversity. And then in his poetry, he makes sense of it holistically. The content of his poetry, however, is overcome with difficult knowledge of secrets buried in graves, of abandoned women and illegitimate children, of brothers fleecing brothers, and of a past that nonetheless still somehow bears the promise for the future. And not only in his poetry, as I mentioned, Shevchenko is a very talented artist. In fact, it's through his art that his freedom is won. These are two images that show us a great deal of change and transition in his artistic worldview between this year, 1842 to 1843. What we see on the left in Katerina is a meditation on what he calls the pokrytka, or covered woman, a woman who has been seduced and then abandoned by Muscovite soldiers and then alienated by her own community. And in this romantic canvas of Katerina in 1842, you can see the use of light here, which is really striking and very much in keeping with the work of his mentor and teacher, Karl Bülow. Here, the figure of Katerina is bathed in light. She's virtually angelic, but you can see in the left side of the canvas, the Muscovite soldier abandoning her. And then at the foreground towards the right, you can see something of this judgment of the local community around her, who do not accept her after the abandonment and do not accept her act. But 1 year later, as you can see here in 1893, the vision grows darker. This work in sepia, called Slippy, or the blind man, features a blind minstrel. This is a very common figure in Shevchenko's poetry, one he adopts as an image of himself. He self-fashions as this type of figure. That is some sort of bombastic prophet, but rather as a modest and humble and indeed destitute figure. You can see how in this sepia, the blind man is accompanied by a crippled boy to his left. And then behind him, quite literally marginalized in this work, is a young woman hidden behind and concealed behind this fence. And the fence extends right through the center of the canvas, almost inviting us to want to tear it down. The reason for this transition between 1842 and 1843 is that Shevchenko in 1843 returned to Ukraine after almost a decade of being away in the imperial center. He was owned by a man named Pavel Engelhardt, and only in the 1840s free to return to his homeland. Similar, this is just a quick image to show you the seminal collection of Shevchenko's poetry in 1840. And then on the left, his own drawings, once again, of this Kobzar minstrel with a crippled boy to his side. In this work, Bogdanovi Ruiny, the Votovi, you once again get a sense of this visual polyphony. So it's a rather dour portrayal of the remnants and debris of the estate of a very prominent Ukrainian historical figure, the hetman of the 17th century, Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Dark, but yet at the same time, Shevchenko always offers us this slant of light in the foreground, and even a foreground that is showcasing this resilient, robust flower and plant, indicating that renewal and regeneration are always possible. So we see this visual polyphony here. What I'd like to talk to you about today is first forgiveness and then solidarity with the subaltern. In poems like My Friendly Epistle of 1845, Shevchenko seizes upon this polyphony, this play of many voices who are really never introduced. So that makes Shevchenko difficult to read. He doesn't explain who necessarily is speaking in his poems. He will do so through a change or transition of meter. You have to almost read him aloud to understand the entry and exit of different voices. But what he does here in this poem is model forgiveness for toward one's neighbor. The full title of My Friendly Epistle is quite a mouthful. І мертвим, і живим, і ненародженим замакам моїм в Україні, не в Україні, моє дружне послання. The irony of this title is that this is not a friendly letter at all. This is a poem that absolutely eviscerates Ukrainian elites for their insults and crimes against their neighbors, particularly Ukrainian serfs and Ukrainian peasants. How fierce is this rhetoric? Well, first of all, Shevchenko not saying a you, a spoken you. He shouts this you. This you is materially wealthy and yet fails to see their duties to their own people, to the neighbors and the peasants around them. These are people who take on heirs, forget their own culture, abandon their own sense of local authenticity, and speak the language of the occupier, begin to perform according to the traits and attributes of the imperial center. And here you can see just how insulting Shevchenko is toward this you. Kamenitsia nadolude, dite yoredevi. Come to your senses, imbeciles, you foolish children. It's not the nicest way to talk to your own people. Certainly not the nicest way to speak to your readers. Kamenitsia, vutelude, oliko vam Buddha. Once again, kamenitsia, redeem yourself, engage in an act of redemption, acknowledge a sin towards your neighbor. Otherwise, evil will befall you. This constant address of a you, the spoken you in the poem, is not that we can liken to interpolation. Interpolation is a concept introduced by Louis Althusser in his critique of capitalist ideology. I was just in Times Square 2 days ago, and Althusser would say, I was constantly being interpolated by the various advertisements around me. This is a hailing that takes place in which I, as the addressee or possible addressee, turn around in a kind of who me moment, suddenly accept that I could be the intended addressee of an ideology, and in this sense, of a national membership. So the fact that Shevchenko is calling out to you is already a way of amplifying that the reader is in some way Ukrainian, not because of the language they speak or the religion they profess, but because they're reading him. And listening to his words. So over the course of the poem, 255 lines, Shevchenko exercises mercy because he ends up enveloping these addressees that he's been shouting at the entire poem and instead accepts them into the family. This is the way the poem ends up concluding. I mentioned Obrata. This is right out of Matthew 25:40. Right? The least of my brothers, accept them, embrace them, the smallest brother. The final lines, embrace them, my brothers, I beg you, I beseech you. So in the same way that the poem begins with kamenitsia, redeem yourselves, it concludes with omenitsia, embrace, come together. And so in many respects, we can see a certain kind of activity taking place in the poem. And we can liken it to a poem drafted, as it were, by way of a compass. So at the center of the compass is the eye of Shevchenko's persona. On the periphery out there, doing all these terrible things, is that spoken you. I'm getting all those insults. And then there's the unspoken you of the reader right in the middle. If you're a Ukrainian reader in 1845, you probably don't identify with the person being insulted. And increasingly you gravitate to that lyrical persona's eye. You feel the attraction of this moral center. What ends up happening over the course of the poem is that the I, the spoken you, and the unspoken you of the reader come together in this coalescence towards the end of the poem. This is very much the practice of mercy in action, forgiveness that brings the national community together in a holistic way. Shevchenko's message of doing unto the least of my brothers is not national. As I said earlier, it's universal. It's global. While he was in exile, where he, once again, was forbidden to write, paint, or draw, he composed a series of works, again in sepia, which call attention to the poverty and the suffering of particularly children in Central Asia. So in Kazakh Boy on the right, our experience of what should be a lighthearted moment of a young boy playing with a cat is shaken by the sight of his distended belly. And the fact that the darkness in the foreground obscures his face. You'll notice how the poet places himself behind the boy. So that's Shevchenko in the background. He's quite literally on their side. And he's looking out at us with an expectant gaze. What are we going to do about the conditions these children find themselves in? Similarly, the Baigush, the beggars, also from his period in Kazakhstan, two young boys at the door asking for food. Once again, Shevchenko is with them in solidarity, looking out at us, scared for us to act. This brings us back to Kafkaz. We began with this poem. I want to conclude with it here. This is a remarkable poem that is difficult to read because the voices are constantly shifting. But they begin with the presentation of Prometheus being tortured by an eagle. Now, normally the myth goes that Prometheus is being tortured by a bird of prey, a raven, a vulture, but it's an eagle for a reason. Because, of course, the double-headed eagle was a symbol of the Russian Empire. Prometheus is being tortured every day, as we know. He restores himself overnight and then goes through the torture once more. For Shevchenko, the struggle of these Circassian and Caucasian, Chechen, English mountaineers against Russian conquest is very much like the struggle of Prometheus. They may seek defeats day in and day out, but they must remember that a new day will begin and they will regenerate their energies in the future. За горами гори хмарою полити, постійні горем кров'ю полити. У конвіку приматує там орел карає, що він дуже добрі ребра і серце розбиває. Розбиває це не віп'я живучої крові. Воно знову оживає, сміється знову. Не вмирає душа наша, не вмирає воля, і не стійте не вихори на дні моря поля. не скує душі мужньовоїн і слово живого, не понесе слави Бога, великого Бога. The energy that sustains Prometheus is the energy of God. That energy cannot bind the living spirit or the living word. This is the spirit that
Заводені гори, хмарою повечі, засіяні горами, кров'ю тілечі, спокон віку трави тея та морел карає, що день Божий дав беребра й серце розбиває та не вип'є цілющої крові, воно знову оживає і сміється знову, не вмирає душа наша, не вмирає воля, а не ситий не виворе на дні моря поле, не скує душі живої, слова живого, не понесе славу Бога.
For those of you who have read Kavkaz before and heard it recited, there's often a grave male voice in your ear. That was often the way that the poem was intoned, at least in my experience. And performers like Tanya Havrilu actually restore Shevchenko's rhythm to this almost jazzy, bluesy cadence, and really lets his assonance, his talent come alive. So, we have a really deft sleight of hand in Shevchenko's poetry. His expression of this holy freedom, this concept of defiant freedom that is holy, that powers moments of anti-colonial resistance. This is internally processed as deeply spiritually foundational by the people of Ukraine. So it's a message that is transnational, meant for those on the Black Sea fighting off Russian conquest, but meant for those back home. It's a source code of an ethics of liberation and care that knows no political, religious, or ethnic boundaries, but doesn't face them either. And I want to conclude with a powerful image that I know most Ukrainians or all Ukrainians have seen. It's a moment from the autumn of 2022 when Ukrainian soldiers in the Kharkiv Oblast effectively released and rescued this concept of volya, of freedom. Remarkable, because this ethics of liberation in action is almost mythical. The soldiers were liberating the town of Balaklia, and in these hastily occupied towns, Russian forces would often put these billboards that attested to this message that we are one people with Russia. This is a violent rhetoric of assimilation. We are one people with Russia is just another way of saying that Ukrainians are Russians, and they just don't know it yet. They certainly don't mean that Russians are Ukrainians. So this is a dangerous act of epistemic violence, and these billboards were performing that role in occupied territory. When these towns were liberated, Ukrainian soldiers would pull them down. And on this occasion, soldiers pulled down one of these messages of violent assimilation, not knowing what they would find beneath it. And they were amazed and indeed staggered by what they discovered.
Слава Україні! Слава Україні! Героям слава! Де? Де яка суття? Ти що? Да, мама! Але як так? Іван впала в сині гори, кривою путні. Іван лицарі були, Богом не забудьте. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас сила і воля святая. Тарас Григорович Шевченко.
Beneath this Russian propaganda billboard was Shevchenko's message of comfort and solidarity that we read earlier. Message that people resisting colonialist aggression have defiant freedom on their side. Holy, sacred volya, volya svятая. This is a moment of liberation in which this concept of freedom of itself is indeed excavated, rescued, and freed. It's a moment in which poetry is liberated, quite literally. and in being liberated, immediately speaks and advances this cause of further liberation. Again, this is liberation that's not simply national, but universal. So this moment makes clear that, of course, the resistance of Ukraine's people is more than their own righteous self-defense against colonialist conquest and aggression. As we've seen, their fight involves the liberation of the very idea of freedom itself. That's why I call Shevchenko freedom's liberator. Literally frees it for us to enjoy. Obviously, this is a value that we as Americans purport to uphold. Their fight of Ukrainians, is our fight, and their security is our security. It is a security that is geopolitical, certainly. More than that, it is existential. So when we understand the messages of Shevchenko, we can see the nature of Ukrainian defense. We can understand that Ukrainians will defend themselves whatever it takes. But I think we can also see why Ukraine can win, provided we do what is necessary to help them. Now, today in Ukraine, statues to Shevchenko are protected in sandbags, as you can see in front of you. They are covered in steel casing, as you see in Kyiv on the right. Russia's war of aggression is about silencing Ukraine's culture. It's about destroying its identity. It's about stepping on the throat of Shevchenko's song, the song of forgiveness, national consolidation, and transnational solidarity. And when we study him at places like Notre Dame and make a commitment to advancing the study of Ukraine, not only for the short term, but for generations to come, we not only restore him to view and amplify his voice and the voices of millions of Ukrainians unheard for generations, we also renew and refresh our own voice and empower ourselves just a little bit to pave a way toward a more just, empathic, and peaceful society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rory. We have about 15 minutes for respectful questions or very brief comments. Who would like to break the ice? The invisible ice.
Pressure's on now.
She's not. That's maxed out.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very moving, and I find the timing for this question a little bit unfortunate in that respect. I'd like to thank you very much especially for commenting about the meanings of the word volia in Ukrainian, about this entanglement of those three different, well, not really different, why you can't just think of it, concepts, but concepts for which there are different terms in different languages. And I find it absolutely beautiful that Ukrainian combines all three of them, freedom, will, and volition, because this is a trio that should not really be separated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcel. You know, it's not only Rory who's to impress you, it's also you who impress Rory.
By the way, I'm sure, is anyone wearing the Ukrainian trident at the moment? And why? I think. The trident, of course, the trezub has a particular kind of shape. I don't have it here, but many have read a lot into the shape of the trident, having the ve, o, el, and ya, spelling out volia in its very shape and form.
Yeah, thanks, Rory, so much for that really moving narrative. Question and comment, I think I'm going to try to them up both out, because I think I'm probably not the only one in the room who's been experiencing a great deal of shame in relation to this. And I think it's very much tied to some of these kind of mythological paradigms of anti-colonialism that really your scholarship is predicated on. And when we see the current administration, let's say, imitating Darth Vader perhaps a little more than the rebel forces, I begin to wonder not just what this means about contemporary global politics, but if we're not really talking about a lot of our own ghosts, right? I wonder if you care as gently and carefully as possible to maybe unpack some of that.
By ghost, you mean Ukraine's ghosts or our own?
Well, I mean, I do find it, even as some of us would so much like love to jump up and cheer for everything you've said, and we're such heroes for supporting Ukraine against, Putin. Some of what you said about Circassia could be said with the indigenous peoples of North America, right? So like there was just so much. That's what I'm talking about with the ghosts, right? Like all of us are complicit, and not just this ultimate big bad guy, Russia, that, we all are kind of very, very upset with at the moment.
No, you're absolutely right too. Obviously, thank you, Sean. Introduce our own history here and our own shame. Obviously, when it comes to Native American cultures, indigenous First Nations here in North America, we grow up at least casually learning them. And I think most Americans, whether they want to really admit it or not, will recognize the violence that was perpetrated against them. However, as you know, in Russia, this is not considered. And in fact, it's completely obscured. And frankly, it gets obscured with our help. And this is where an additional layer of shame has to be addressed. Because in the context of Western studies of Russia, we have absolutely looked past so much of these acts of ethnic cleansing. And right now, my biggest nightmare is 50 years from now, students from Cambridge or Notre Dame going to Mariupol and walking around and thinking this is Iskona Ruskaya Zemlya. This is perennial Russian land. Because that's, of course, the message that's being foisted, not only on occupied Ukrainians, but on us. And we are complicit in going along with that narrative. And I think it's time for us, and obviously in our field, we talk a great deal about decolonization. It's a term that we don't often understand. I think it begins with us excavating these moments in history. When I was here in the fall, I talked a lot about Crimean Tatars. Circassians, I think, are a major warning because the world knew about them. So Britain, for instance, supplied arms to the Circassian people for a very long time. This was a war that took place over 100 years. I certainly didn't learn of it when I was a student. I learned of it through Shevchenko's poetry. There's something beautiful about that, and there's something terribly wrong about that. So I agree with you that we have a lot to account for ourselves. I think sometimes what we need to do is just take those first moments to act. And Shevchenko is a great guide. He's not perfect by any means, and I always run the risk of talking about him. I have such admiration. I don't want to romanticize him either. But he speaks of sleeping in freedom being worse than slavery. And I think about those words all the time as an American, that we have freedom that we don't take seriously, that we take it for granted, that we're sleeping in freedom. So that freedom involves us, I think, taking steps to learn more about the world around us. That's why it's great Notre Dame has focused so beautifully and generously on the study of Ukraine. And I think we just have to take it step by step, but never lose sight of the ghosts behind us all.
Thank you, Rory. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudius.
Rory, thank you very much for that very nuanced approach in the weaving of poetry, song, etc. Very powerful and really neat to see. This last image really hits me in a way that I didn't anticipate. And that is this whole aspect of the hidden, as in the statue on the left, but also the revealed in other ways. And in some ways, what we see here from my perspective is really this element of long-term curation, nurturing of heritage and protecting of heritage. The part that strikes me on the one on the left is traveling through Irpin and Bucha a year and a half ago when I was there filming. And going through there, we came to a particular place where, of course, with Bucha, what had taken place with all of the destruction. And there was this large parking lot that was filled with cars that had been destroyed and burnt. and they'd all been brought to this particular place merely as a means of cleaning out the streets so that cars could go back and forth. What was extraordinary is that this rusting pile of thousands of cars had poetry and art and all these elements, not just the flags, but all of these elements. And now you make me wonder, thinking about what was there and sort of that as a compilation. It's no longer there, but it just thinking about at that point, sort of this reconstruction of memory and of history, and at the same time, the curation. So I guess more of a comment rather than
anything. Ian, it's a great comment because I've seen those. I don't know if they were exactly the same vehicles. Certainly, tanks in the center of Kiev as well that have the same excerpts of verse. Often, there's a great deal of rage written on them, but there is a profound act of appropriation, right? You claim that destruction back, and you channel it in a more constructive and more directed direction. And you, of course, would see borite se pohodete. Borite se pohodete would be something very commonly seen on such things. So that appropriation, I think, is an act of therapy and healing. And I appreciate you, raising that.
May I ask a meta question, then Andy will finish us off. Being invited to give a talk in the Global Affairs School, and so that the role of poetry in the better understanding of global affairs. Can you say something about that, please?
Yes.
Well,
that's a great question, Clemens.
I know.
Ukraine is a geopolitically, geostrategic country. It has been for a very long time, whether we've been acknowledging it. If one considers the role of Ukraine in the world, not simply now, but at various pivotal junctures in the past, none of those things, none of those developments would be possible were it not for poetry. We as Americans have documents, constitutions, declarations. Shevchenko's poetry, and not only, has actually powered a very strong civic national movement. It is a movement that is not only about ethnic Ukrainians, but let's say ethnic Russians, Crimean Tatars, Jews, who understand the spirit of Shevchenko's message, understand that they're confronting to the east the Russian autocracy, and to the west a Polish aristocracy. They want to carve out something different. And the vessel, the medium that allows that carving is poetry. This is a case where the humanities have a really clear, significant role in establishing how empirically the word can actually move the world. And so Shevchenko is just one example.
Thank you. Probably our last question.
Thank you, Rory. Really appreciate just the wonderful, passionate presentation. For those of us who grew up in the Ukrainian American community, Shevchenko's always been somebody we've struggled with. As kids, we had to learn his poetry. We didn't quite understand that poetry. To many of us growing up in sort of cowboy and Indian culture, it was kind of defeatist and very gloomy and grim. And so we're also, I think, in the Ukraine community in the United States, we're rediscovering Shevchenko, and your lecture, you'll also great deal. Over the years, we've begun to really appreciate the fact that Shevchenko was victorious ultimately. The language that he wrote in is now spoken by about 40 million people around the world. When you compare that to Native Americans, which is horribly tragic, the Cheyenne language is almost wiped out. Maybe 100,000 people still speak Navajo, maybe 100,000 still speak Lakota. The Ukrainians are really proud of the fact that they've maintained their language and that there are more people speaking it now than Norwegian, Czech, a bunch of other languages combined. But the other piece that, for me, that really resonated was this idea of non-chauvinistic nationalism, that Shevchenko is universal. He's not just speaking to Ukrainians in isolation. And the other poem that all of us had to learn was learn of what is foreign to you, but do not forsake your own. And that balance has been a huge part of the Ukrainian ethos, which is not meant to be oppressive or offensive to other cultures, and in fact, embracing other cultures while still embracing our own. And that's something that's very exciting to see how that's playing out in the modern scale.
Thank you. Thank you. This is the mainstream of the Ukrainian national project. And obviously, there are always fits and starts where others take it in different directions. The mainstream is this civic, national, non-chauvinist group attitude towards others. And this is what made Shevchenko so useful in the Soviet period. I could have shown you a number of Soviet agitplakati or agitational posters in which the image and the words of Shevchenko was meant to inspire Red Army soldiers, particularly of Ukrainian origin, on the front. They were pumped out in tens of thousands of copies. Some of Shevchenko's own poetry was published in small editions that could reach soldiers at the front. And when the Soviet Union was advancing this very cosmetic idea of a friendship of peoples, Shevchenko fit perfectly because the attitude was never chauvinistic. It was always exploring different cultures with a great deal of empathy and sympathy. Obviously, the Soviet treatment wouldn't foreground his more strident Ukrainian feelings, his indictment of colonialism, which is something that in the early decades of the Soviet rule is indeed focused on and then is strategically forgotten. So he is indeed someone who is highly complex. I know what you mean about the trepidation and intimidation that I've seen, younger children approach Shevchenko with. But I think it's by listening to Tanya Avreluk sing or Helena Pash dance and perform his poetry, suddenly it opens up, I think, an artist who has been sometimes too confined by the national, too isolated on the bus and on a pedestal. And we need to open him up even further and clearly in very tragic and horrific circumstances that's taking place now.
Thank you so much, Rory.